Web3 is the internet of ownership, meaning that for the first time, you can actually own a piece of the internet.
In my 35 years in business, I built 19 companies, invested in 78 startups, and made millions of dollars along the way. However, the man I'm about to introduce you to has made billions with a B. Yat Siu is the billionaire founder of Animoca Brands, one of the leading companies in the Web3 space, and his company is currently valued at $6 billion. An hour of this man's time is more than the average salary in the UK. So if you can't sit down, get a notepad and listen. I'm sorry, but you're probably not going to make it.
Yeah, what are we going to cover today?
Well, today we're going to cover what we think is the purpose of business, our business philosophy, and what it means to be early in the space. I'm also going to be talking about how you, as an entrepreneur, can manifest your own future, as in how you can find success. I also want to talk to you about the role of money, what is money, how much you need to know about it, and the importance of ownership, which is the next topic. And of course, that covers into the area of why capitalism is so important and why it's actually a force for good if you know how to apply it.
Don't hate capitalism. Don't hate it. You've got to learn why you've got to love it and how to leverage it.
And in the context of that, then I want to talk to you about sort of this really next generation internet that is Web3, why it's so important. And of course, you've probably heard of tokens, which is my next topic. And then of course, the importance of finding your particular niche. And then we cover a little bit about community and, you know, talent as well, hiring people, and how to raise funds and grow your business.
Let's go. Let's do this. So let's start off with the purpose of business. This is something people never talk about, and it's such a shame, and I'm excited to get into this. So go ahead, tell us what we need to know.
Yeah, so I mean, the very first important thing, I think, when you think about the purpose of business, I think you need to think about what it means to you. I think you need to think about that as a really important part, because you know, some people might do it just in very simple terms. They just want to have a better life and make money. That's one level. But later on, actually, as you grow your business, your purpose actually becomes bigger and more important. It could be as simple as owning a restaurant, but you want to give pleasure to people in terms of having great food. Or, you know, basically the question really comes down to what impact do you want to actually create to your customers, to your community, or to yourself, right? And I think that then ends up being a net good for society. So the other thing I like to think about business as well is what role does your business do in helping society as well? Generally speaking, if you make money and you employ people, you're already helping society in a very small way because you're helping grow business and making money for other people and growing the economy. But to me, those are some of the key purposes of business. But maybe then delving a little bit into the philosophy of business, I would say focusing on areas that you think that give you impact means the things that you think that you are good at, right? Which kind of, I guess, moving a little ahead is around finding your niche, right? In other words, what do you think you're good at? Your friends will tell you, you might know that as well. And for us, for instance, you know, one of our philosophies of business is to be early in the space because that was how we believe we can make the most impact and drive more value in society. And by that, we often use this chart called the diffusion of innovation chart. And you know, this stage is typically known as the innovator stage. This is when you have new ideas that are being created. And then you have a stage that's called the early majority. In that stage, actually businesses typically already know about it. So for instance, if you're talking about the internet in early 2000, or if you're talking about mobile apps in 2011, that will be the early majority stage. And that stage of business, when it develops here, it will grow just because the market grows. And if you're able to build your business in the area of early majority up until you get to this part, which is kind of known here, would be known as a late majority, or essentially developing to that stage, you will benefit from more natural growth because the market will just simply grow. It's kind of like if you've been in China in 2000 and you're in that stage, you'll grow just because of that, for instance.
So how do people identify this? If you're listening to this video and you're like, oh, I love that idea, I want to be early, how do you be early? What's a practical example? How can people go about being early?
Well, I think it goes down to essentially, I think, you having to understand yourself, your impact, and the impact on society.
This is almost like a secondary thing. If you discovered these first 3 steps, how you can impact your life, what you're good at, what you're going to do to help society, what you enjoy doing, primarily, right?
So, I mean, this philosophy doesn't only have to apply for wanting big impact business for billions of people. Like, for instance, if you're early on the internet and you want to build like an e-commerce company, sure, that's one way to do it. But for instance, let's say you're in your community, in your neighborhood, and you identify in your neighborhood that nobody has a Chinese restaurant, for instance, but all of your friends are talking about Chinese food. You're the only Chinese restaurant in your neighborhood, and you think everyone loves Chinese food. You're early, right? You know, and how you notice when something becomes popular, then actually all these other restaurants that are the same, or these other fast food chains, or these other shops that are the same, all suddenly pop up in the same neighborhood because there's demand for it. But typically the one who's been early actually has, early bird catches the worm, as they say. So they have typically an advantage. Again, that's not a sort of a universal rule. Of course, there's people who come late as well and do really well, but generally speaking, that's where you basically benefit from the area. And so this philosophy, I think, can be applied for any business, whether it's big or small. It could be your community. Are you early in your community? Or are you trying to do something global in terms of impacting the world? I think this applies in everything we do.
To use your restaurant analogy for people listening as well, like you might think, well, I don't, there's already a Chinese restaurant in my neighborhood. Well, move where there isn't one. You can also be early in places. You can go to markets where things don't exist yet, right? So you can create the early, even if it's not where you live, which is another reason I tell people not to get a mortgage when they're young, because they get trapped by the location
they
live
move
in.
around, right?
Go where the opportunities. I went to Hong Kong, as you know, in 1997 because I saw people were leaving and there was an opportunity, right?
Yeah. And this is about niches as well, right? So for instance, back in the early days when we started building internet companies in the 90s and early 2000s, that was a niche. I mean, people forget that the internet back then had literally only tens of millions of users globally, worldwide, not the 6 to 7 billion people that there are today. So that was a niche. But from that niche, we were able to sort of develop being really early and then just grow with the market as more people entered that space.
Interesting. The hardest thing is surviving when you're early. Because I remember trying to sell digital services to brands that had just gone through the dot-com bust.
Yes.
Like, no one cares about the internet. The early 2000s, the internet's over. With the headlines, and sometimes it's surviving long enough to stay in the niche, to stay in the early part of this graph, right?
Yeah. So. And just to be clear, just because I'm drawing this chart doesn't mean the chart goes this way. Actually, what happens is even though there's a general goal, which again it talks about sort of your goal and your impact that you want to have, the chart to that looks more like this, right? Basically, right? Sometimes it can go all the way down here before it looks up.
Which by the way, ties into why you've got to enjoy it. It's got to be for you. It's got to feel personal.
That's right.
Otherwise, you won't stick at it.
Yeah. And I think this is the thing, when you get to something where you feel so strongly about your impact, where the purpose is greater than just your own, so to speak, then you will survive these cycles because you're doing something that is so meaningful for you.
So purpose of business, not talked about enough because people too quickly jump into like how to make money and the niche of how you can build a business that's worth millions. Having a purpose in your business. Think about this carefully so it works for you. Right, next, what are we talking about next? Next up, manifest your future. Now, when I was 20, someone said to me, manifest, and I laughed. I didn't think it was a real thing. But let's talk through manifestation. Maybe you can explain to us how you see it all working in a practical way.
Well, first, when we talk about manifesting, we should talk about a little bit about what drives us as humans. And what drives us as humans universally in everything we do is narrative. We are narrative creatures, right? And I think there was an interesting commentary, being slightly bit quasi-intellectual in this one. I think they called it Homo neurans. I forgot who actually quoted that. Basically saying that we live on stories. We exist as storytelling creatures. Even things like money and society and culture are all storytelling. And so when you think about the biggest ideas in the world, whether these are revolutions, ideas about our freedom, ideas about who we are as individuals, what rights we have, these are all stories. These are people manifesting their future. Right? These are people who imagine something that would be better for them or their society, and then they created that. And that's true for all entrepreneurs. I mean, I remember a time when being an entrepreneur wasn't cool, right? It
wasn't that long ago.
It was only like maybe 20, 30 years ago, where being an entrepreneur was the equivalent of being unemployed.
Couldn't get a job,
so you started your own
business.
So that's why you're an entrepreneur. You couldn't work for a company, right? But actually, really manifesting your sort of your future is around imagining where you could be and the business that you're growing. And while it sounds a little bit like, oh wow, you're manifesting and you're imagining, but actually that's what we're doing. You're imagining, imagine when you want to buy a house, for instance. There's a dream for you. You want to achieve that dream. What are the steps that you get towards that? Or you want to open a shop somewhere, or you open a business, or you impact a community. That's all a form of manifesting, right? And that's also one of the reasons why I also look at business plans, especially early stage, a little bit skeptically, in terms of, you need to have an idea of how to get there. But the actual business plan will always change because, you have to sort of navigate the space as it goes. But manifesting the future, I think, is absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, if you manifest, you can actually turn that into reality. And every entrepreneur story you will have heard of started with this idea of manifesting, which maybe some people call imagination, right? Or creativity. But what are these things? What is imagination? What is creativity? It's all things that happen in our head, in our own reality, that we then turn into actual reality.
Everything, if you're watching this on a phone, on your laptop, sitting on a chair, that was all in someone's mind and they made it real.
Correct. That's right.
Simple.
They manifested something. Right?
Totally.
And even think about it in your own life, if you're not thinking about it in terms of being an entrepreneur, when you're sort of running in a competition and you're running in a race, the chances of your success, if you manifest your victory, even if you don't necessarily get there, will actually be much more powerful because you're actually going to run harder. Or if you believe you have a chance of winning, even if it's remote, you're actually going to work harder for it. If you enter a race thinking you're going to be last place, what's going to happen? Probably you'll be last place. But if you're going to enter the race thinking you're first place, even if you don't achieve first place, you're going to do everything in your power before to try to get there. And business is exactly the same.
I actually imagined my last company, Fluid, getting bought by PwC, who we were partnering with at the time. I never said it out loud, and it happened. Because you work towards that goal because you believe it. And Henry Ford once said, if you believe you can or you believe you can't, you'll be right. So it's also important to have a positive mindset around this stuff, right?
I mean, manifestation generally should be optimistic and positive,
Yeah.
right? That's very different from, you got to deal with market realities, of course, but you need to be optimistic. I think if you're not optimistic, I think it's very difficult to be an entrepreneur, because then you're coming in with the wrong mindset, which is really what manifesting is about.
Okay. So any other practical advice around manifestation before we move on?
Well, not practical advice, but I would say, for instance, you gave that story about people selling their businesses. Well, this became a very typical exit strategy for a lot of tech companies, and suddenly that became the norm. But people forget that, say, decades before that, selling your business was completely not normal at all, right? And so an entire entrepreneur community in the tech world essentially manifested a path towards saying, we can have an exit by selling the business, right? And then suddenly VCs came around, actually asking you as an entrepreneur, what is your exit strategy, was specifically more about when and how do you sell your business, for instance. I mean, that became a strategy again. And again, this was something that didn't exist before.
Well, so again, I think the whole concept of manifestation for a lot of people is considered woo-woo, but if they apply it to their lives, they can manifest whatever they want their life to be.
Right.
If you believe your life's going to be a certain thing, you can work towards making it that certain thing.
One of the things I love about sort of family life, or as a parent, is I think of cooking as a form of manifesting. Right? You imagine what the food is going to be look like at the end. You're making.
You haven't seen my cooking, though, have you? Right. That's probably one of the things to try and help people. Like, you need the right ingredients. You need a bit of guidance.
Exactly. Yes.
So we can get to that a bit later, right? Exactly. You need the right funding.
Yes, exactly.
But that's true. That is a great way of looking at it, actually, because if you can make it, the idea of what you want to happen. But it's like your graph previously. It's not going to go up like that. It's always going to be like that. Yeah. But that's why I love the second bit is manifestation, and the first bit we just talked about, that whole all purpose of business. It all ties together.
And I think the thing is that if you can manifest for the long tail, if you can manifest where it goes here, which could be years away, then I think you have the stuff to be an entrepreneur. Yeah. Whereas if you might only be able to manifest short term, I think it's harder for you to do that.
I think most successful entrepreneurs have a great imagination, and it's something you can learn. And we actually get de-taught it. My son at school is being told not to imagine so much. He's daydreaming is what they call it, and actually we get told as adults not to daydream, right? And I think manifestation is a form of daydream.
Well, I don't know if we have time for this, but I do want to sort of share that story when you talk about sort of not that you're taught imagination. All humans are born creative and imaginative. There was a study done by George Land and Bethany Jarvis. This was in the 60s, and they were basically doing a test to show how astronauts and like scientists, if you send them to the moon for NASA, how can they solve a problem divergently? As in, how do they solve a problem in a creative, imaginative way? Because when you send someone to the moon, shit blows up, and nobody's never done this before. So someone has to be able to problem solve. So they took that same test and applied it, I believe, in the 60s to children between 5, 10, 15, and then gave the same test to adults. And so children who were 5 years of age were able to solve the problem 98% of the time.
Crazy.
The vast majority, which basically meant all children could solve it in creative ways.
And technically they're all geniuses when they're at that age.
Yeah, there's no limit to their imagination, right? And then when they became, I don't know the exact number anymore, but then basically when they became 10 and in 15, the number gradually went down. Guess what the number was for the ones that were 21 years and above?
It's very low, isn't it? Like 1% or something ridiculous.
2%.
2%, yeah.
And now when you think about what is the percentage of change makers, entrepreneurs, crazy guys in the world, it's probably somewhere in that number.
Yeah. So in part, you've got to get back to your childhood, I think.
Yes.
To be a successful entrepreneur, you need to
don't lose your creativity.
Yeah.
And I think there is a role for parents as well, if you're a parent, to actually make sure that your children maintain their creativity. Because in this future world of, AI and sort of, machines and so on, much of the sort of manual work is no longer necessary. I mean, your children are not going to be truck drivers. They're not going to basically be sort of, accountants in the classic sense. They have to be creative, which is what we as humans are.
I think it's something, again, that why we need to fix the education system, because the education system today is not designed to help people be creative. It's designed to help people memorize to get an A in some exam based on what you've remembered instead of what you've come up with. Critical thinking is missing, isn't it? We're really talking about critical thinking really here, aren't we? Like the ability to actually come up with an idea, think of something. And humans' brains are incredible.
We all solve problems creatively.
Yeah, and so we need to bring it back. And if you want your business to be successful, you need to have this. And you have it. If you think you haven't got it, it's been suppressed in you through the education system. So wake up. Next up, what is money? I had no idea how money worked until I left school and started a business. So what do we need to know?
So there's a lot of YouTube videos that talk about what is money, store of value, basically, exchange currency, that kind of stuff. But today I want to give you a perspective on money that is quite different, but important to understand. I think of money as a social system. It's a social network. So when I think of money, when you think about all these little nodes around the world, right? Basically, the ability for you to transact and interact with each other actually is what money facilitated. The value of money also comes through the power of that social network. So why do we think that the US dollar has value, for instance? It doesn't come from the fact that it actually is gold-backed, because the gold standard is long gone. People say, oh yeah, it's the GDP of the economy of America. But America has more debt than its GDP. So technically speaking, why does money have value? And it's upheld because we as a community believe it has value. And we're creating a system around that through banking, through loans, through mortgages, through systems around the world that basically give us that power in terms of having money having value. But ultimately, to understand money, we think, it's understanding money as a social currency, as a social network. And the systems around it, therefore, have implications of power. If you understand how the social network and the social power of money works, then you understand how power works in financial systems, right? Which currently is centralized and controlled by banks and by governments and so forth, right? And this then comes down to another element, which is when you study financial literacy, people often confuse financial literacy with, I studied economics, but it's completely different. Having sort of economical theory about sort of how economics work as a social system, but understanding the role of money in our current world, for instance, is completely not understood. So I'll give you, for instance, one example about sort of how money is created. Most people believe that money might be created by a central bank, or that money is created by the government. But actually, most of the money today is created by the private banks. And how do they create that money? Basically, if you get a mortgage from a house or something, actually you end up getting a mortgage. They print that money. It's digital money that's printed at the moment in time, which creates an inflation of that cash. And theoretically, you need to pay that back. But actually what's created is a kind of social debt. One of the reasons why so much money has been poured into real estate is because the banks have come to realize that actually they make money through loans. The money that they loan you, which they print, isn't actually money that they own. They make money through interest. So
this actually makes me a little angry. I feel angry towards the banks when you describe it, because basically it's a bit of a fugazi, isn't it? Like the banks create, the house prices go up, the value of something goes up.
They have an incentive for their prices to go up.
Yeah.
They have an incentive for giving more loans, because the more loans they give, the more interest they can charge, and the interest is their income.
Yeah.
Right. So when you look at the balance sheet of a bank, actually the money they issue technically sits as a liability. Yeah. Right. And the assets belong to the bank as the pledge of that liability. Right? And so this housing bubble that we've seen over the last decades has really been an incentive system that incentivized banks not to promote small entrepreneurs and businesses because that was more risky, but to actually just continue giving real estate loans because that was technically safe, and basically just continue to charge interest from it, thereby creating this huge inequity that we have in the world, where if you're land owning, you're great, and if you're not, you're basically fucked, right?
Plus, even the landowners are enslaved. They're basically working for the bank. They don't even realise it. You know, the price of the house has been inflated. They're paying huge amounts each month for that house, and they're having to go to work to pay, selling hours most of the time to pay for that thing. That's all been created from nothing.
Yeah. So money is literally being created from nothing, and I think this is the thing where there used to be the gold standard, where you were supposed to.
Yeah, but they got rid of that a long time ago.
They got rid of that, Also, by the way, they only got rid of it in the last century.
Right.
So there wasn't something that was they got rid of thousands of years ago. This was something really just pre-Nixon, where the gold standard.
So money today is the first virtual reality that we've all bought into as real, really. I mean, we think it's real. Like, this is most prevalent in Hong Kong, where we're both from, because they actually are a little bit more honest. The banks actually print the money. So each of the banks there, Standard Chartered, HSBC,
right.
They actually print the money. It says on it. And they have their own design for the money, which is less transparent in places like America or the UK, because it looks like it's come from the government, right? But yeah, and as you say, so when people are listening to this and they've hopefully just blown their mind about how money works, how can they leverage this knowledge? What do you think is my translation, my quick guess is going to be like, well, take control of your network?
Yes. So first of all, the most important, so money in itself, accumulation of money is therefore not to be viewed as traditional type of savings, right? I hear a lot of people saying, take a certain portion of your money, put it in savings in your bank, get your like X% of interest. But the problem is that because of the way that money works and the inflation and the printing that happens in the space, actually, if you did that over the last few decades, you would have actually had negative value on your interest. The way to get there is ownership, right? Basically holding the type of things that is one level higher than money. So money is no longer that store of value that people used to think that it is. But because you don't understand the financial system, you don't understand the sort of how money works, you basically get taken advantage of. And so there's multiple classes of capital. Going slightly philosophical, if you look at, for instance, Bourdieu's example, he says that there's economic capital, then there is symbolic capital, there is social capital, and there is cultural capital. And ultimately, we aspire in a way kind of like this. It's not exactly this kind of diagram, but essentially what we're saying, economic capital, which is money, is actually the base level. And it helps us get to these areas. For instance, I use economic capital to send my kids to better school, so they can therefore have a better cultural capital or better social capital because they have a university degree. If I have a university degree, then I have symbolic capital, right? I care about that type of stuff, right? If I don't have money, I can't send them to school, I can't partake in this. In fact, there's an interesting thing about cultural capital, us being from Hong Kong. You know how people who speak with a slightly English accent in Hong Kong and basically are Caucasian often get treated better in Hong Kong? That's cultural capital. Right?
Yeah, I was an idiot young kid when I went to Hong Kong, but they've let me in meetings to talk about important things. I think because I'm from England, somehow that gives me some weird
and English posh accent or whatever.
Yeah,
Maybe if
it's
you're in
just
the
true.
UK, you wouldn't feel that. Yeah. But it's one of the things. So for instance, even like mannerisms, right? If you know how to behave in a meeting, if you have table manners, if you go somewhere, that's a form of cultural capital. Yeah. But how do you get there? Is you get through essentially using money as a way to basically sort of travel through this, right? And this symbolic, social, and cultural capital is actually what's really powerful. So owning real estate, for instance, or owning a house, or owning your business, or being an entrepreneur, having equity in things, actually ways in which you enhance that and then grow that. And these are the areas that actually are not naturally inflatable in the way that money is. Right? So in broad context, I would say that money is a means to an end, and it's a means to an end to these things that matter to us as humans, and we need to invest in ways in which we can grow into these things that we can own, whether this be reputation in cultural sense, ownership in terms of other cultural symbolic assets, for instance. But just saving money is actually not the right answer. If you save money for your kids' education over the last 10 years, it'll be worth less today than what it was 10 years ago, just because of the way it was inflated out.
And I think if we follow people who were listening to this, the takeaway I'd probably try to give people is don't make money your top priority. I, for example, think if someone's enjoying what they're doing every day, they're rich. There's plenty of people who've got a lot of money, but they're trapped in working 50 hours a week as a lawyer, for example, and they don't enjoy it. You know, so maybe understanding how money works also makes you realise that it's not a real thing. You need it because that system's set up that you've got no choice right now. You need money to pay for food and pay for rent. But actually, if you kind of restructure this around like making life about enjoying what you do, I think you're already rich because you've got the social capital.
Yes.
And if you're enjoying your day-to-day and around people you like, you've got the cultural money. You know,
right. I would argue, for instance, that a sort of well-respected chef in a local community restaurant enjoys much higher status in symbolic, social, and cultural ways than perhaps the banker who makes a big bonus and drives a Ferrari, but who happens to live, you know, in some fancy district somewhere around the world, because of that capital, which is more valuable. And I think that's the respect people look for at the end. They want that type of capital rather than necessarily purely economic. The economic is the means to an end. But you know how hard that expression is. There's a point where having sort of endless amounts of money or, you know, lots of money somehow doesn't give you happiness.
Well, I think the threshold is 100,000 a year technically, and after that it doesn't make any difference to your happiness.
Right.
But I want people, as we get further into this video now, we get into the other parts that you need to know. Remember how money works and how actually it shouldn't control you. You're probably listening to this video wanting money. We're going to help you get money, but remember what real value is, what being truly rich is, and we're going to come to that more in a minute. Next up, ownership. Now, I've had the privilege of hearing this from Yat directly over the years. You don't own your shit, and we're going to teach you how ownership works and why you need to own your stuff. So go ahead, Yat, tell us what we need to know.
Well, the very basis of ownership is what you've probably heard of many times in your own life or with your friends, and it comes from this thing called property rights. This is something that you have the privilege of today because you live in a democratic country, at least most people watching this channel, I presume, and if you own an asset, it is truly yours by contract, and there's a government that's protecting it. It wasn't, and I would say ownership starts not only just by assets you own, that's the way we think of it today, but it starts with owning yourself. I grew up in Central Europe, so in Germany and Austria, right? You know, our last names like, you know, Metzger, which means butcher, for instance, right? Or maybe if you're in a certain sort of township, you have this name. What is it? Why do we have these names? It's because for the longest times, most of us didn't even own our own identity. We were serfs working for a lord. We didn't have our last name. So imagine if you can't even own yourself, what that actually means, you know, and that's when people talk about sort of being a slave and being a serf. We evolved from that. I mean, you know, England was one of the first places in the world with, you know, the establishment of, you know, the Magna Carta to sort of talk about a Bill of Rights of some form that basically said that actually we can own our stuff and we have rights that are sovereign to us beyond some type of sort of, you know, sort of feudal power that can basically tell us who we are and what we own. Sleight
of hand though, because yes. I mean, nowadays people, they think they own their lives, but they don't. They're controlled by the bills they have to pay and actually even property rights, right? Most people, if you look at the contract, either the bank owns your property,
yes,
or the Crown in England has the right to take your property off you at any point without even asking you.
Yes. So the basis though on this point is that when you have property rights on something, you truly own something, then actually you can invest in this, which then allows you to have an investment possibility and an investor mindset. Because if you don't own something, you can't grow it because it's not yours. And this, by the way, isn't just in terms of, for instance, all of you who might be running a restaurant and you're building the success of the property by bringing lots of traffic into the restaurant, a big problem in Hong Kong. After 10 years, the landlord goes and says, well, thank you for that. I'm going to rent out that restaurant to someone else who'll pay me higher rent. And you're basically own nothing. You ended up building the value of that property, even though it's not yours, because you never had ownership. And this now goes into other areas, of course, which is basically our data, right? We don't own our data. Every time we post a photo on Instagram, every time we share something on TikTok, we're getting some kind of network attention, we're getting likes and follows, which is actually their money, by the way, right? They're paying you in their social money of likes and follows, but actually they're receiving all that value, creating their networks, creating value, and who owns that property? Who is able to create that value? It's those platforms, right?
If you're on social media right now, you don't own that community. The social media platform you're on owns it. right? So in the future, you have to own it. If you work somewhere, you need to own equity where you work. If you're on a platform, you need to own a part of that platform. Otherwise, you are not leveraging your own personal brand. Back to the point about you're kind of a slave. You don't even realize it. Back in the old days
Correct.
when you didn't even own your name.
Correct. And in very simple terms, the most successful people in the world today are all people who have ownership in important things that matter to them or to society. The wealthiest people in the world today are the biggest shareholders in their companies, or are the biggest landowners in whatever property that they have, or own the equities in whatever companies or restaurants or whatever they do. They are actually the wealthy class, and the ones that aren't are typically the labor class. And this is one of the biggest problems we have today, is that, again, because they don't understand money and they don't understand ownership and capitalism, they therefore don't value it. And the 1 percentile, which is where all the wealth is going, is actually the capital class, which actually has ownership. And so you need to have ownership in what you do. And you need to own, whatever time you invest in, whether it's a company you work for, a project you do, you need to seek a way in which you can have ownership in this, because that's the only way you can guarantee a long-term stake in this. And in the past, governments used to do this with high taxes, right? They would, in some ways you could say government took away a number of your rights through taxes by redistributing that to society at large in some form or fashion. But that no longer is true. Even though people are complaining about tax rates are much, much smaller today than they were even 50 years ago.
But the tax system now is more efficient. So if someone pays me £500, I'm paying tax on it. But that £500 they paid me, they already paid tax on it. And then when I give someone £500 that I pay tax on, that person's also paying tax on it. So it's just become more efficient, hasn't it, the way the tax system works than it used to be. And I feel like a lot of people listening are struggling to get ahead because they're probably paying in England 45% tax, and then national insurance, and then VAT. So translating this back to someone listening who has no money, we're basically teaching them a mindset, right? We're teaching them a mindset here to own what you work on.
Yes, and to basically think of yourself in everything you do as an investor in some form or fashion.
Right.
I would argue that as humans, we all have an investment mindset because we're all growth-oriented. And an investment mindset doesn't have to just mean money, although that's obviously a very obvious one. You want to invest your money to have ownership in something. But ownership translates into all of our social circles. I want to have a great relationship with my family. I want to have a great relationship with my friends in my particular network. Actually, when you're in your social network, you stake a claim in it. You have a stake in that, which means you have a sense of ownership. Right? And if you get ejected from that community or that social network, that's really painful, right? That's something that actually you lose ownership in that. That aspect is really important to understand. So meaning your investor mindset isn't just economical, it's social and it's cultural as well.
I think it's also about control. So recently someone approached us and said, oh, we'd like to launch a clothing brand. They're a clothing manufacturing company. They're like, we'll make the clothes and then you sell them and we'll split the profit, which initially is like, oh, that's great. We don't have to make the clothes and we can make profit. But then I realized on this mindset, well, I'd rather own the company that's making the clothes. Mm-hmm. There's no point in building up their business and their brand and not having any benefit, in our case, for our community, because we give the money we make away to our community. But remembering each time you do a deal, well, do I own the source?
Yes.
Or am I just part of the system? So are you not really owning what you're working on again?
Yes.
People get tricked quite a lot.
And I think the question when you don't have ownership is, what value are you receiving from it? And we often get tricked into thinking that the value we're receiving is reasonable. Like, for instance, me creating 1 million user following, as in your case, on Instagram or on TikTok, is great value for you when in fact the platform benefits much more broadly,
sure.
For instance, right? It's okay to have a partnership in which you have co-ownership and you work together, but typically speaking, bear in mind that you are renting their space, right? Mm-hmm. And you need to build your own equity. That's really important.
By the way, a very practical point. If you're building up a social media network today, and I've got 8 million people following me, the way to really own it, an example would be, and what I'm doing, is I'm asking people to join my mailing list. I'm asking people to connect to me directly. So yes, the social media platforms are using me, and I'm using the social media platforms. But once I build my community, I ask them to join a platform where I am in control of that community, and that Facebook can't take it away from me, Instagram can't take it away from me. I can always connect to you without their permission. I don't need to let them be the gatekeeper, but it's a step-by-step process sometimes.
It is.
Getting out of the, let's call it the poverty trap partly, like getting out of it is a step-by-step process, right?
Yes, you need to basically begin to own some form of property, in which is a step out of that. And it doesn't have, the other thing is it doesn't have to be expensive, for instance. I mean, one of the more famous stories in our particular world is that we used to have a lot of games and apps on the App Store on Apple, and we were developing our products, we thought, on Apple. And then a year later, they didn't like us for a reason they never explained to us, and simply deplatformed us and removed all of our apps. It was like hundreds of apps that we lost. Hundreds of employees were potentially out of a job simply because someone said, we don't like you, and they didn't even give a proper reason. Right? And so at least when you're in the government, there is some kind of judicial process. You can take them to court, which is all around this idea of the defense of your property rights, which doesn't exist in the digital world, which you can now do.
But the best thing that have happened to you probably, because then you developed your own platform.
That's right.
And also you don't need them now.
That's right. And also that's one of the reasons why we ended up going into Web3, because we realized that's actually how we can have sovereign ownership.
Web3. We're going to get into that in a minute. It's really important. Ownership, thanks. That's really important for people to learn this, to help them scale up their lives and be financially free later. So capitalism, actually an evil word to a lot of people, an opportunity for others. I think it's not understood. Tell us what we need to know.
Well, capitalism really is, if you understand capitalism, you will understand property ownership, and you will understand the value of money, and you will understand essentially how you can build your wealth. The whole world today is run on capitalism. The top 1 percentile in the world understand what capitalism is, and it starts with this idea of property ownership. But what is the foundation of capitalism? It really is the exchange of your free goods and services between people. So in other words, if I'm able to have basically, again, I sort of draw this in people, right? If I'm making apples, I can sell it to this guy who wants, pears and whatever, and I create a network of people, and this basically creates an element where you can have trade and you can grow assets from them. That actually, forms a foundation in which you have a free market, right? And you will know that in the places where you have a free market, that's where capitalism can truly thrive. But it begins with this foundation of that you must own something, right? In other words, if you don't own your apples, then you can't sell them, right? That means you can't actually partake in this thing called capitalism. But in capitalism, basically, is the element which you basically can then build wealth from as a business. One of the problems that a lot of people have in capitalism is that they look at the concentration of wealth, because of the fact that maybe a small number of people own the property, and they look at capitalism as something evil because they can't partake in it. But I think the answer isn't that you try to take wealth away from the capitalists, but rather you do what the capitalists do, which is you become property owners. You basically become a capitalist yourself. The vast majority of the world where the wealth is concentrated is amongst the people who know capitalism versus the ones who don't. Right? And it begins with property ownership, and it begins with the idea that you have a free market. I would also sort of say that, when people build this thing called a monopoly, which is a bad thing, which is what some people say is why capitalism is bad, right? You have basically, one giant company controlling everything. Actually, my perspective on that is it's the opposite of capitalism, right? Meaning, when you build a monopoly, which is what a big company becomes, they destroy this idea of a free market, right? For instance, when you think of the advertising industry today, when you're buying advertising on Facebook, are you buying advertising, if someone wants to buy advertising on Instagram to sort of use your platform, is he talking to you directly? No, he's talking to Facebook. And Facebook runs an algorithm that doesn't benefit your cause, it actually benefits specifically the platform. And they will disintermediate. I can't necessarily even buy traffic on Simon's channel if I wanted to, because maybe Instagram doesn't want that. They want to give you 10% and then they give you traffic somewhere else. They decide who gets the money. That's not a free market, right? So the foundation of capitalism also comes with this element of a free market.
I think people listening, funny you mentioned monopoly, because monopoly was invented by a woman who was trying to highlight the problem with putting property ownership into a capitalistic system. Yes. So something shouldn't be in the capitalist system. Basic human needs like water, these days electricity, it's a brilliant invention we're now stuck with, but people need these things in life. So a lot of people hate capitalism now because they see it as like, the evil landlord, which there are many of them, but if you play Monopoly, there's only one winner at the end. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. Zero sum. So how do people navigate that? Now, my answer, and let me know if you think this is the right way to go, is be a capitalist, like you said, make a business that makes money, own your network, but then do good with that profit. Put it back into your community, for example, or give it back to the cause you care about. So
the foundational idea of capitalism is to say that humans are motivated by a form of self-growth, and some people translate it as greed, right? So in other words, I'm driven and motivated by self-interest. And if we're all driven and motivated by self-interest, we will then achieve something better for society, because I will make, you know, better goods than you in a free and open market. And the consumer who's applying and buying it is actually the one who benefits because we're competing to be better at what we do. In other words, capitalism is the engine of innovation. If we didn't have capitalism, you wouldn't have things like Tesla, you wouldn't have companies like Google and Apple, you wouldn't have, you know, blockchain, you wouldn't have, you know, you wouldn't have many of the innovations that we enjoy today, including probably the sort of materials that we have when we go to a restaurant, when we eat at home, the materials in your house. They've all been possible in the places because capitalism was that driver, because there was a human incentive for you to make that happen. In other words, I accumulated something for my personal interest, which was a form of wealth, and therefore I made better and nicer products as a result of that, right? That comes down to sort of the root of why capitalism is so powerful. But the reason why people don't like it is because, for those who don't have access to that, is because they don't see a way in which you can access this. And the answer is that we need to have more people own capital, we think. But because
we want everyone to be rich.
We want everyone to be property owners. And so I think there is
by the way, when you're talking property, you're talking not necessarily property,
not as in
property,
real estate,
but general assets like a company or your products.
So let me put it this way. How many people in the world use Apple products? I know, like hundreds of millions, right? How many shareholders are owning Apple stock?
Yeah,
40,000 institutions and individuals own Apple stock. Microsoft's about 80,000, right? But yet every person in the world basically uses either Microsoft or Apple product. Yeah. The answer, we think, is that every person who is a user of these products should own a part of it, because that's the future of business. Right? That's the future. That's what we think.
Well, a lot of companies, a lot of capitalists won't want that, though.
Well,
a lot of existing successful people won't want that.
Well, and I think this comes down to the power dynamic. But actually, what will happen is you have more wealth overall. So, for instance, kings and queens in the time. I mean, the Queen of England, or the King of England, as it is today, right, had more power. But actually, I would argue that they're wealthier today in terms of capital wealth, because it's more decentralized, it's more open, and the whole market economies are greater because more people are partaking in the capitalist framework.
So we've seen it in China. The last 20 years, 400 million people have come out of poverty into middle class. And China, you know, less likely to go to war with other countries, less likely for more poverty-driven wars, which happen. I think that's made the world a safer and better place. That so many people in China.
Most people don't appreciate that China is probably more capitalist than most European countries.
Well, I know, because they instantly think communism when they hear China, but they don't.
It's, you know, taking away the word communism. China has a respect for property rights. People can make money in those places, and so actually China is very capitalist. In fact, if you look at Asia, you know, for instance, two great examples. If you look at South and North Korea. 40 years ago, South Korea had a lower GDP than North Korea and a smaller population. What was different about South Korea versus North Korea? South Korea adopted capitalism, also democracy, which is a tenet of that. And as a result of that, you know, they actually grew their economy to become essentially the 12th largest GDP in the world.
Because initially it's decentralization of money. So the money in North Korea is all with one family.
Decentralization of power.
Decentralization of power. And the capitalism, in a way, if used right, can decentralize money in a way, because then everyone gets a piece, not just the king and queen.
Think of the history here, even just here in
But hasn't it gone
UK?
wrong? Like, because now today you've got Facebook and you've got Google and you've got this massive companies that control all this.
I'll get to that. But if you look at the history of the UK, all that power was centralized around essentially the monarchy, right? And the kings and queens and the lords around that. And then you had a merchant class that came. And what did they have? They didn't have an army. What they had was capitalism. They had money, they had wealth. They made the country richer, but then they became more power. That ended up decentralizing power. So more capitalism, more property ownership, as in property rights, actually, with the distribution of that wealth and power, creates a more balanced economy. And so what we think the future should look like is essentially this thing that sort of Rawls talks about, which is this property owning democracy. And if most of the world, if most of us actually in a democratic framework were property owning in the things that are meaningful, I think society would be much better, broadly speaking. And what, to your question as to what's wrong now, is that we've gone the other way. So we actually went more property owning somewhere 30, 40 years ago, and then essentially through tech companies, the ownership of data and the concentration of power, and also the I would say the betrayal of money, in the sense that, you know, quantitative QE, quantitative easing, where basically the central banks started printing money to solve for some of the financial issues, actually created more disparity in the wealth.
What created inflation?
It created massive inflation, which basically only benefited the people who were already property owning, making it harder for people in the classic sense to become property owners.
Well, I mean, physical property now is getting bought up by all the big companies as well.
Correct.
So it's all getting centralised. So again, on the conclusion for capitalism, because I think this is a very deep subject. People listening, I think maybe they need to use capitalism to build wealth, but learn how to turn capitalism into a positive by sharing that wealth. Is that a way of summing it up?
Well, I think it goes back down to, I think first of all, don't look at capitalism as a bad thing. I know that words like capitalism, socialism are ideologically charged words, but look beyond that and essentially look at what it means for people who are capitalists. How did they make money? How did they, leverage?
You've got to compete with those people, otherwise you won't win. Yeah,
exactly. And you can't look at it just simply from. I think there's a lot of people who just reject capitalism.
Yes.
And, that's bad.
They don't understand it.
But you need to understand it. Yeah.
But I think social capitalism is pretty interesting, where you do good with the money. I think is a business model that can, if you use it, like if you were Amazon today, and every time someone bought something from Amazon, they benefited profit-wise from Amazon, not just a select few. You'd have a company everyone would want to use instead of Amazon.
Yes, I also think though that if everyone was in an open market where you're actually competing, then the outcome of the product that you're building will be broadly better. And in this case, innovation is the winner. But I also agree that it's not specifically about social capitalism. I think if you are a successful capitalist, you will hire more people, you will invest more as well, and that's the idea as well. Imagine if Apple and Facebook actually used 10% of their cash and actually invested it into companies building on the App Store, or just broadly speaking on entrepreneurs. They would basically have a fund that's larger than most VCs put together. And that to me is another form of good, right? Investing in communities and growing businesses, which can also be profit generating, is still a net positive impact on society.
Okay, Web3.
In very simple terms, Web3 is the internet of ownership, meaning that for the first time, you can actually own a piece of the internet, which seems kind of funny because after all, what are you owning at the end of the day? And what you're able to own through Web3 is your data and the related network effects that basically this data produces. And why we're so excited about Web3 is that it is the one framework, when I talked earlier about ownership and how do we give equity to all the world, is you can have billions of people own things in Web3, which you can't do in the physical world. You can't imagine how every citizen in the UK could now own.
Well, the legal paperwork alone would be too much work.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But outside of the legal paperwork, just the cost, the capital, the incumbent structures simply won't allow you to own, a piece of England, as it were, if you're a UK citizen. But in Web3, everyone, through tokens, can essentially become a property owner in Web3. And you become an owner in those network effects, which we can go into later. So that's really what it is. It's the internet of ownership. To the extent that Web 2 was the social internet in terms of where you could read and write to the web, actually now you can read and write and own. So you can own your followers, you can own your data, you can own the value that's generated from it. Your identity is your sovereign ownership. Right now the identity belongs to Google or Facebook or Apple, actually. If Google deletes you, you cease to exist as a business or as an individual, for instance. But in Web 3, it's yours.
It's also decentralized, right?
Correct.
It's on a system that, well, they say is not hackable, but you can make a mark as to what you own and it's there forever,
yes.
right? So if someone's listening and they're like, okay, I quite like this Web3 thing, how do I get involved? What do you think the steps are to getting connected and involved in Web3?
Well, I think the most important thing for Web3 is first, you've got to understand how it works. Not to similar our topic about money. You do need to get a crypto wallet. I think there's some topics in Web3 that you'll have heard of. They'd be like crypto and blockchain. And again, these are words, sometimes even the metaverse, right? These are words that might have some element of, I guess, chargedness to us in terms of what
negative connotations.
Negative connotations.
It's just like the .com era. The internet had a negative connotation for the longest time until people understood its power.
Yeah. But these are all elements essentially that form Web3.
So try to get a wallet. Go learn how crypto works, how the blockchain works, how metaverse works. What else can people do?
Right. And I think, and of course, the other thing is that you can go on things like crypto Twitter, right? Where they say people talk about crypto Twitter as a source of information, but also there's tons of blogs and resources out there which you can sort of learn. But I guess the biggest way, if you want to get involved in Web3, is today it's become much more popular, meaning that you'll probably find someone within your circle that will understand Web3, that's probably investing in tokens or doing something in the space, and you just go talk to them. And you'll find that that community is very open, because what we want is more people joining the space. Therefore, they'll be very willing to help you explain and think about the space, and there's talks on YouTube and there's videos for you to get resources on.
Company-wise, who do you think's doing it? Who's interesting to look at if people want to go look at companies in Web3? That, of course, is your business.
Yeah, well, outside of our business as Animoca Brands, you can look at companies like Coinbase. Coinbase is one of the leaders in the exchanges. They have lots of great information and resources that are out there, for instance. And then, of course, if you want to start sort of learning more about the space, there's different things like you can go on Messari, right? Messari is basically a crypto research type of place where you get information on, right? And then, of course, there's news media like Cointelegraph and CoinDesk. There's Cointelegraph, CoinDesk, and Forecast Media, right? These are all places where you can get information and learn more about Web3.
And of course, helpbank.com, we're going to be doing more and more on Web3 because we want you to own a part of what we're building. Because that's the other thing, isn't it? I think people can actually own where they work. It's not only where they put their time and platforms in the future, like Facebook equivalent. There must be competitors coming up that are going to be building on Web3 and compete with platforms.
There's lots of them. I think, again, maybe some facts, right? I mean, Web3 today is about a $2.5 trillion market. But there's still only a small percentage of the world that is actually in the Web3 space. And so earlier, when you talked to me about sort of, I guess, purpose of business and business philosophy, if you want to be early in the space, to me, being in Web3 is kind of like being early in the internet. And so if you partake in that space, you'll get the same opportunities that you can have in the early internet days of making a mark, having impact and purpose in a space that has yet to define itself, right?
See, a lot of people hear about crypto went up, crypto's gone down. They think they're not early and it's all kind of come and gone, but it's still very early, right?
It is very early because, when you talk about volatility, what are we really talking about, right? So at heart, Web3 is a deeply capitalist system. So I need to be very clear about that. And tokens are a representation of network effects that we can own. So when you think about owning a token, you can actually own a network effect. That is the property rights that we're talking about. So you've probably heard of this thing called Bitcoin. You've probably heard of Ethereum. These are tokens. But why do people buy these tokens? They don't buy the token because it gives you a great yield. In fact, Bitcoin gives you none, right? They buy it because you become a member of that network effect, so you can participate in the growth of that network. And when more people grow and build in that network, like developers and applications, for instance, you can benefit simply from that ownership. Tokens represent these network effects. One crude example is, imagine if Instagram had a token. Actually, those tokens would be in the form of likes, which I think is a form of social currency. Likes is a social currency. When you think about follows, that is another kind of, a follow is another kind of social currency. How many times has someone come over to you and said, hey, Simon, can you follow me, please? Why do they want that? Because they want your social currency attached to them. You are giving them credit, right? And that credit essentially creates a credit-debit relationship no different than it does with money, right? Except in this case, likes and follow are an illusion because you don't own it. But tokens is actually a way to represent true ownership in that, which you can then trade and you can give to someone else, and you can pass it on for actual value that then can be exchanged, and it creates a market because you have property ownership. And with property ownership, as we said earlier, that is the foundation of capitalism, which is why I say again that it's inherently a capitalist system. There is no way today in which you can own a network effect. If you want to partake in the network effect of Apple, you have to sign the Apple developer contract and pay 30% of everything you make to Apple. Plus, you've got to follow the rules. If you want to partake in the network effect of Twitter, you can join Twitter, or X as it is now called, but if they don't like what you do, they can get rid of you, right? All those millions of followers you have and any one of you building on these platforms can be taken away. And in Web3 and through tokens, you can actually own that and own a stake in the very networks that you're helping construct. And this to me basically is the true power of tokens. You can have billions of people own tokens, which means they can own pieces of the network effects they're building in, but you can't have billions of shareholders in the equity in the companies they're building. I don't know how many people in the channel might be working for gig economy companies, whether this is like an Uber or an Airbnb or that kind of stuff. But one of the biggest travesties I always felt is like, why are Uber drivers not owning a share in Uber, the company? And so what happens now is that the Uber drivers, one of the reasons why they have a problem in the future is that Uber's already made it public that they're going self-driving cars.
They're one of the biggest investors in self-driving cars, so they never really cared about the drivers. They were just using
the drivers were simply a means to an end. But the very people who helped grow the Uber network are actually the very people who are basically now getting shafted. But if they owned shares in Uber or a stake in the Uber network, then actually, even if it was time for them to retire, they would have a benefit for that because they're rewarded for that effort.
Ironically, Uber would be a better business as well, because the drivers would stay, there'd be a loyalty thing there.
Exactly. That's the other thing that's really powerful as a business. If you create a token Web3 framework in your business, what property ownership does is loyalty, much higher loyalty. Just think about everything you own in your space that you actually feel like you have ownership. Like if it's a house that you own, you're going to invest in it. You look after it. You feel much more attached to it rather than something that is just fleeting or moment.
So how would you go about, like people listening, like, oh, I like the idea of doing a token. What's the process? Teach people about that quickly.
I think you have to go around, the very first thing is understanding basically the value of the network effect, right? And one other way to look at the value of a network effect is that a network effect is inherently social. And I always felt that social media platforms really managed to sort of hack into the very thing that makes us human, which is why they're the most powerful companies in the world. That's the other thing. Though the companies who own social are actually the most influential, powerful companies.
Well, they make leadership get voted on because they control the narrative.
Yes, right? and governments can get toppled, right? And in fact, it wasn't that long ago where I think it was the start of the year where even Canadian news agencies were deplatformed by Facebook because they didn't like some of the commercial aspect that the government tried to enforce. And so a democratic country could be deplatformed by basically a private company.
Right. Well, that's what people like Mark Zuckerberg in this election is being coveted because he can affect the election.
Yes.
But people don't own these platforms that they spend so much time on, and that needs to change. I think.
And so the inherent thing is that really what's happening when you own a piece of the network effect is you're owning a piece of the social network of the communities you're building in. Right. So every token is a representation of that social network in some form or fashion. And to me, it's not that different from how the internet was in 99 and 2000, 2001. And so this comes down to the other point. When you talk about the concern about prices going up and going down, well, that is capitalism, right? When you see a capitalist environment, you'll notice, if you look at the stock market, it goes like this, okay, right? And maybe it goes slightly up overall, but generally speaking, it's very, very volatile. And so I think a lot of people don't appreciate that capitalism is an information system, which tokens actually now makes it more obvious, that is volatile in terms of telling you what the market's like. If a business is not doing well, the share price goes down. That's what the market does.
I think that's the thing that scares people about it, because it feels like gambling for some people. They thought, if I sold tokens to my community and then they go up, that's great. But at some point they'll probably go down, because everything goes up and down, then that's volatile. How do you protect people from that?
So I think there is something paradoxical about the idea of wanting to be an entrepreneur and a builder in this space, and essentially looking at, you should minimize risk, but there will always be risk. A market is generally volatile. Capitalism is inherently volatile as a system, and tokens simply just amplify what's already there. So let's do a thought experiment. How many people lose their jobs in this country every single day?
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. How many of them actually get a new job in that same day? Probably roughly the same number. So when you look at it from a chart, it might look like, oh, pretty stable, 2% unemployment, looks pretty good, right? But what actually happens in the course of the year, it's like this, okay? How many businesses actually close every day or every week? And how many reopen, whether it's a restaurant or anything you do? It looks like this. So if you actually created a daily chart about the volatility of the market we are in, it would look like this. Yep. What tokens do is they represent that on a real-time basis. Yep. And of course, we have to bear in mind that not all tokens are equal, like how not all businesses are equal. So we're not saying every token is great, right? Go into the next meme coin or something. That's not what we mean. They all represent elements of a network. And if you choose to be in a network that is there for very speculative and gambling purposes, fine, right? But know what you're getting into. Versus if they were going to join your social network, then they know what they're doing. And if they're really believing in what you do, it doesn't matter what the price is today, because you're caring about what it means.
It goes back to what you were saying earlier about purpose. You know, if you're getting involved in things with purpose, you stay for the long term, it'll probably be all right. But, you know, I invested in a token, interestingly enough. It made money and then it lost a lot of money. But I was in the network for 6 months and made 4 life relationships within that community, within that DAO. I was in a DAO.
Yeah.
So now those people I'm working with forever. That's social capital I've got forever. Even though the token itself maybe didn't necessarily work out. That's the other thing people have to keep in mind. Right? There's a long-term plan.
But then certain networks, when they keep growing and accelerating, I mean, if you look at, for instance, the price of Ethereum or Bitcoin, actually over the last 5 years, you know, that's an example of a network that was very volatile, but broadly speaking grew as a space. And again, I go back to this sort of being early, which is that if you're in the space early, like in Web3, if you look about Web 1 and Web 2, you remember how many people were doing search engines?
Crazy.
InfoSeek, Excite, Yahoo, all these companies. At the end, there were a few of them, right?
Yahoo was the biggest search on the planet. People don't realize Yahoo was the biggest.
Yeah. And it's in some form or fashion still around, but it's nothing what it was before. And again, right? It's the same thing, really. It's just how markets and capitalism works. And you, as a participant, need to be able to participate in that, or build your own businesses and just grow in the space. Because even if we invested in various of these companies and it didn't work out, our entry into the early internet space allowed us to get us to where we are today.
And learn. We learn. We be a partner. So let's talk about something I really love, which is niche and communities. Let's do it together, point 8 and 9, because I think they're connected.
Absolutely.
So, and before we get on to what people need to know about hiring, which a lot of people listening might not think they need to hire, but if you want to grow, you need to hire. So we're going to talk about that next. But niche and community, what do we need to know?
Well, I mean, look, there's so much to say here, but really, I think, as I said earlier, you want to focus on a niche area that you have deep feel deep purpose and passion for, in the sense that that's something that you want to sort of dig deeper in, right? You're not going to be, the word niche to me doesn't mean small market, although it could feel that way sometimes. Niche to me means just an area of things that you want to deeply focus and concentrate on, that you want to be, a level expert on it. So if someone were to come to you and say, you're known for this, that's your niche. Right, you're known for either social media or for marketing.
Well, with Helpbank, I wanted to help people start businesses and help people build their businesses. Correct. That's a big niche, but it's a niche.
Yes, and it started off as a niche in the sense that your business started small and you were helping a certain group of people. Yeah. And today,
just going live on TikTok and answering people's questions.
8 million followers. You're a celebrity and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that actually all comes from starting as a niche, but then growing out into the community that speaks to you. And because of the internet, niches have become much bigger. So one of the reasons why sometimes niche has, I think, a little bit of a negative connotation being small is because people are still thinking, in a pre-exponential way of the internet, right? They're not thinking about network effects. They're thinking more in terms of your community, right? And so this niche here, that was a small niche here and small niche here, this niche might be in Hong Kong, and he cares about, let's say coins or stamps, right? And there's a community here in London, and there's a community here in, let's call it Beijing or something, right? These are small communities, and maybe they're a little bit bigger, but generally speaking, they don't interact with each other because it's a small niche, right? But because of the internet, that small niche can now be connected globally. And so when you start connecting all the similar interest niche, suddenly this niche becomes bigger. And the community that you're addressing is also bigger. We used to think of community in a much more narrow sense, right? In terms of, what nationality, maybe what sports you're interested in. But today, when you look at the internet, what it's created is there are millions of communities that are interested in you might think weird stuff, but generally they have created niche communities around that, which have then enabled things like people trading Pokemon cards, for instance, for lots of money, and other things like this that maybe would have been considered ludicrous before, but are now possible because community are networks that give these niche networks value.
The other thing, a lot of people listening might not realize that some of the biggest brands in the world started as niche communities. So for example, even Apple used to appeal to creatives, very niche, like graphic designers. And I remember in Hong Kong, we were getting the first Apple computer with the glass blue top at the back. That's what the creatives wanted. And it was very niche. Designers could afford it, designers would buy it. But that created, normal people would see it and go, oh, that's cool, I want to be a creative type, right? So then they'd buy it to try and be cool like the creative people. So you start off in a niche, but it can blow up into so much more, and that niche can grow, right?
Well, most people don't maybe realize that Apple's global market share, I think, is around 26 to 28%.
Wow.
Right? Which is, the rest of the world is actually using Android when it comes to phone devices. And therefore, you could categorize Apple from a global sense actually as a niche company.
The most valuable company in the world.
The most valuable or second most valuable company in the world, depending which day you look at. Between that, Nvidia or Microsoft, between the three. Anyway, $1 trillion company, somewhere between the 2.2 to 2.5 trillion dollars in value. And yet it is not the one that owns 90% of the market.
I think that's why actually maybe, sometimes, again, if Instagram was initially, again, creative people. You're putting up your pictures, it was really beautiful and staged, and so they were niche. And then I think over time you can grow out. Facebook was also like universities, right? Niche. And that can actually cause an appeal because people want to be a part of that community.
Well, I mean, niche also is not just a form of specialization, but also brings with it a kind of scarcity and exclusivity as a result.
Scarcity is such an important word in marketing.
Yeah, and scarcity, we don't mean that you want to create something that's just rare. It just has to be special to your particular community. Yeah. And what also happens, one of the reasons why I think the internet grew the way that it did, is that when things actually were too scarce, as in too hard to get, people actually started creating their own scarce narrative. I go back to this idea that we as humans are narrative, and so we create our own stories, and we create our own stories around sort of what's scarce and important to us, which is the foundation of these communities.
I genuinely think today, if I was starting a business today, if I had no money, I was starting a business, I'd start it from community first. Like, what community can I serve really well and build out community? Because that's another competitive advantage I think new companies can have. Because if I think about closed networks, let's say, I'm trying to think now, like in England, we have Sky TV, right?
Yes.
Sky TV is an awful company. They are, and they're never going to sponsor this channel, so it's fine. but they don't have all of their customers in a community. Because if we were all in a community, we would be complaining about them all the time, right? So most companies don't want to create a community. They want to keep the customers separate. And even if you go and complain on Sky about them, they'll delete you. What I'm getting to here for people to learn is, like, if you can build a community that actually love your business, that effect, and then you give them ownership, and it has a purpose, all the things we've just taught you here in this download you've given, you will win.
So I think, to your point, maybe one thing to think about is that to be a business leader today, you need to be a community leader.
Yes.
So this was very different from before, where when you climb a corporate ladder, the leadership of that community was maybe the corporation itself, right? And people talk about things like, climbing the sort of corporate ladder was essentially a form of really what community were you serving? You're actually serving the corporate community within the group, right? That's kind of, I guess, the game of politics that some people might see in large corporations. But actually today, because of the internet and because of the growth in the space and broadly what we see in terms of community activations, actually now the leaders in the space are leaders in their specific communities, which then also get often represented through tokens. I mean, like it or not, when you see all this political conversation going on, you see different groups forming political groups around them, these leaders in those political groups end up becoming political influencers. Whether they designed it or not, doesn't matter. They become leaders in their particular community. And you can see that from your own groups of communities. How does someone become a leader in whatever they do? They actually become leaders in their communities, serving, to your point, the particular niche or topic or sort of issue that they want to solve.
Yeah, and in the past you might have seen brands like Walmart and wonder how the hell would anyone unseat them. A brand like Amazon comes along and creates a faster, better service. You can beat these companies like Amazon by thinking about community and starting in a niche, because they don't have a community either. That's their weakness. They can't build it from community first, and that's your opportunity if you've learned how to do this. Next, we're going to talk about talent and culture. Now, after this, we're going to talk about funding, and it's going to blow your mind. But I think you need to understand all of these things that we've gone through today first before you can sort the funding bit out. So talent and culture, which I've spelt completely wrong. But what do we need to know about it?
Well, first of all, I mean, talent, everything you do serves a human purpose. Your business is run by humans. So talent is important. But I would also say that talent is useless if the culture is not connected to the purpose that you're trying to serve. So for instance, you could have the most talented, investment banker in the world, but if he's not actually sort of on focus and on core or whatever business that you're trying to build, then he will change the culture of your business. It will no longer look what you wanted to go. Remember the very first thing I said, what is it that you want to do? What's your purpose? and then drive that mission. So you want to bring people into your team that believe in your vision and share in your culture. And then I also believe that talent, is something that you have to find people compatible with you as well. And you can't just bring people who are just really good at something, but then again, if they're incompatible, it doesn't.
So personal match is basically what you're saying.
So I think alignment is the word I would put, right?
Because I would say manage purpose, not people. If you get the right people, you don't need to manage them so much, because if they care about the same purpose as you, they just want to get to the goal.
So another way to put this is shared vision, right?
Shared vision, exactly.
Yeah, if you have shared vision, then I think the talent will coalesce together. Because in an ideal scenario, you don't have to keep reminding them. They'll know exactly what.
How do you know they have the same vision as you when you, say, interview them? Because some people might lie, right? They might pretend they care about the thing you care about, but they don't. They just care about the paycheck.
Yeah, this does come with a little experience and intuition. And so at the end of the day, I think the only real answer to this is if someone is not aligned with your culture and your vision, then you do have to get rid of them fairly quickly. And again, it might not be that they're not talented or capable. They just are going to be in the roadblock. Because they
won't be happy either, because they're not really working on something they really care about.
And the wrong culture starts to grow like a cancer. And when you're 5 or 10 or 15 people, actually it's very difficult for that to happen, because you as a founder will typically have so much influence and so much weight that whatever lack of shared culture there is will get suppressed. But there is a point when the business grows where you will no longer be able to know who the new hires are, who the new people are. And then from that grows a different type of network that might be more and more removed from what you're thinking. And again, this is where you have to have, for instance, a vision statement and a mission statement. That's really important, because by having that, I know it sounds very sort of, consulting style and whatever, but as you grow larger, the vision might be just tacit and implied in a small organization. But as you grow, you need to tell people, why are we here for? In our case, basically, it's, we want to give everyone a piece of ownership of the future of Web3, and the mission is to deliver digital property rights. It's very simple for us, and that's basically what we want to keep hammering down on people. But you see this, with other organizations that are great, that they have very clear vision and mission statements. So I think that's really important, because then the talent will see this and will naturally be attracted towards this. Because talent, and then when you have that, then you can nurture and sort of cultivate that from within your organization.
I mean, culture also has to be, you have to practice what you preach as well. Right?
Correct.
So whatever your vision and mission is, you as a company have to do it too.
Exactly, you got to do it.
Yeah, I say the same. Like everybody who works at Help Bank has equity in the business, and so that otherwise I'm being a hypocrite when I'm telling people to own where they work. Right?
Yes,
there's no point in saying you should own what you're working on and then not actually implement it within my own business. Right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So anything else from a cultural point of view that you've learned to keep the culture on track? I mean, I think a big part of being a leader is always permanently stating what the mission and vision is. But anything else you think people can do when they're trying to get culture built? So
the way that I look at this is that I look at leadership as a kind of servant leadership, right? Meaning that you're always in a position where you're serving your community. And the community isn't just your customers or whoever you're serving that way, but also people inside your company or your shareholders or your stakeholders. Basically, your leadership is about serving. And I think if you build that kind of culture and everyone else around you follows and sees that, then they'll sort of be attracted and encouraged to do the same. The other thing I would say was really important, and I guess this isn't talked about enough, is incentives, right? So incentives can come, of course, in the form of sharing equity, but typically if you're a startup, you will not be able to compete purely on like really good talent that really wants to join your organization, but maybe you can't pay them the same, for instance, right? Because if maybe they have a family and other things that from a reality standpoint doesn't make it possible to do so. So managing these incentives actually is a really important part in terms of how you attract and retain talent. And this does come to the form. This is why things like like equity, or maybe even tokens in the future, depending if you want to do that, or maybe profit share, or other forms of value that can build up to that.
Interestingly, like at Help Bank, I've noticed that it's a big incentive for my team when we have someone say that they were helped and they tell us, and we share it as a community. Then that feels like success in any given day.
And I was about just to come to great that you asked, sort of made that point, because once you get to one level of incentives, which is purely economic, eventually, if you can succeed your business to get to the point where it's symbolic and cultural, then you have a really, really great business. Because that means that simply working at Help Bank or whatever business you're building is status alone. This is, by the way, what a lot of large organizations achieve, right? For instance, in the early days when Google was a rising star.
Oh, you've had the Google card.
You're working for Google.
I don't know why. I'm not sure what good they actually did apart from help you get in stuff on the internet. But that was a real halo for a while, wasn't it?
Yes, right. They've lost that halo.
They have lost that halo
because essentially their symbolic value determined sort of distinguished. But remember, their early.
They're not doing as much. They're not doing any good in the end, are they? Really, that's the problem.
Right.
That's why.
But that's the point, right? So this was the hook to get them in. But once. It was like an honor badge. I was working for Google.
Yeah.
Or banks had the same too.
Yeah.
Right. When
Goldman Sachs used to be that way.
Yeah.
I hate these brands.
Goldman Sachs or like Morgan Stanley or like even HSBC. Right. If you were working.
But people then leave as soon as they made the money, and because they're not really there for the purpose. Back to the whole reason we're going for all of this.
Yeah. But for a while before the Lehman crisis, before 2008. Being a banker gave you symbolic cultural capital, right?
Yeah.
And for that also social capital, right? If you were, remember, especially in Hong Kong, if you're working for a bank and you were like a VP or something, people would just give you free drinks and they would just invite you for club memberships or whatever. Why? Because you had that. So working for that organization will give you that status.
Yeah.
But the world has changed today in terms right? In terms of where. It's not just about that type of value, but now people are looking, what work are you doing?
I think it's going that way as well.
Exactly.
Young people in particular, you guys listening, let us know in the comments. I think this is true from the young people I've seen. They don't just want to work for profit. They want to work in a business that's making a difference.
And I think that's a generational thing as well.
Yeah, which is exciting. I think that's a great. People always complain about the new generation not caring or being lazy. I think they're just more incentivized by like making a difference.
By the way, you see this in things like, for instance, great restaurants as well. Like something that may not be considered big as a business, but if you are working in a restaurant that has a certain status or a certain reputation, it's actually, this capital is way more valuable than this capital. And I would say, if for you as a business to create sort of this purpose-driven organization, if you can achieve that, then you're well on your way to.
Weirdly, I was at a really nice restaurant recently, and the waitress, she was really enjoying her job because every time she asked someone how was the meal, they're like, it was amazing, best meal I've ever had. She felt happier in her job. So, I think that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, the big one, funding. Last but not least. Tell us what we need to know.
Very first thing I would say is, broadly speaking, money is abundant. I know this sounds strange, because when people say, oh, but I can't raise money, I can't get it from this person, well, it's not a question of, so the question around the access to money is one, but money broadly is abundant. There's a lot of money in the world today. The top 1 percentile in the world, or the VCs that give money, actually, spend ridiculous amounts of money on things that you all might think is ridiculous, whatever that may be. So in that sense, money is abundant, right? But how do you access this funding? Well, one, I go back. It's your mission, right? And your purpose, mission, and your purpose. That's important, because then with that, you want to target essentially the type of investor that appeals to this. So which goes down to this next point. So, investor A or investor B, whatever story, narrative you're building, which is basically the narrative around what mission you're trying to do. And so for some people, and again, I wouldn't recommend this only, but for some people, the narrative might simply be, I'm going to make you a lot of money, right? That's a very typical example. And so a certain type of investor will be attracted by this narrative. Yeah, I'm just doing it for the money. But there will be some other narratives. It could be around social good. It could be about social status. So I'll give you an example of a social status thing. Investing in a restaurant. Investing in a restaurant.
Yeah, I've done it. It's not worked out financially.
Actually, for most restaurants, don't work out as a.
But I felt good sitting in a restaurant saying I own a piece of this.
Exactly. So it's status. It's a different investor type.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is know your audience that you're building and the purpose, and then from that you can attract a certain type of investor groups you can go to. Thankfully, because of social media, because of the internet, because of people like Simon and Help Bank, actually you can reach out to all these investors. Accessing this investor, because this capital is much more abundant today, is actually not the problem, right? It's not actually as gated as people might think. But these are essentially the main mechanisms. Of course, you have to make sense. You have to, I think things like a business plan, depending on what you do, is important, but you don't have to put like a 30-page PowerPoint. I think it's really important that you're able to nail your mission and your purpose and the narrative in something in just like a few minutes, so that people can sort of captivate and sort of capture their imagination, especially in early stage businesses. Once you reach a later stage, then things like how much money you make and your revenues start to make sense. But especially when you talk about early stage startups, basically you've got to talk about sort of your mission and your purpose, and really sort of elaborate on your dream, and then from that you can know which investor groups want to support you. I mean, there's some people who simply just want to do social good, and they'll just invest in you for the purposes of wanting to sort of improve, because maybe they've made a lot of money and they feel that you provide good back to society.
There's a lot of people out there who are quite lazy and don't want to do the work themselves, but do want to have an impact.
Exactly, right? Exactly. I mean, and that sometimes was translated as charity, but actually charity isn't that attractive because it's basically not a sustainable path, right?
Exactly.
But there's other ways to do that. So, and then I would say the one area in terms of being more specific is you need to look at Web3 as mechanisms to help you fundraise, as a new mechanism, because Web3 is community funded. So in the Web2 world, everything was quite VC gated. So you had some person who might be kind of out of touch with what you're doing perhaps as a business, doesn't understand your circumstance, and they have specific narratives they follow because they are working with third-party money. But in Web3, every individual in Web3 is a kind of investor. As an end user, whether he owns tokens in something, whether he owns NFTs, whether he's involved in the Web3 space, which, as I said earlier, is a $2.5 trillion space. That's capital that you could access.
Yeah, people don't know about that. No one realizes. They
don't realize that. But I'll give you one more example.
Huge numbers. You did a TED talk about this, which we can put the link down below for your TED talk. But there was some ridiculous amount of money being held within DAOs.
So yes, exactly. I'll come to that. Now, actually, DAOs. Maybe I want to wipe this out here.
We're going to wipe it out. Whoa.
Yeah, because I think this is important for you as a new form of capital to access that you probably never thought was possible, versus talking to your family or to your neighbors or to some investor. So DAOs, which are decentralized autonomous organizations, I won't type that out, this is going to take too long, just you can figure that out, right? Today have about 30 billion. So in when I gave my TED talk last year, it was 12 billion. $30 billion of value.
It's gone nearly 3 times more since then in a year.
But what's really powerful is not the 30 billion. It's governed by 10 million people, okay? And individuals and institutions. Now, name me one organization in the world where $30 billion of assets and value is governed by 10 million people. And 3 million participate actively every week or every month in where this money gets spent, what happens to it, for the purposes of the networks they're growing, right? So, of course, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to sort of fund your business directly if they don't know how it's going to serve the network. But that's the opportunity, which is that you have access to a pool of capital that, by the way, is bigger than probably all of venture capital in Europe for early stage companies. I mean, 30 billion is bigger than A16Z's fund, $30 billion bigger than Sequoia's fund, right? Draper Fisher, right? I mean, it's one of the biggest resources for capital.
Even I've been involved in the funding game for the last 25 years, and even I'm just learning about this. So grants is sometimes how they take the form of grants. So we're getting offered grants for Help Bank, and that's part of it.
So you can have grants, right? But you could also have just investment. There's investment DAOs, where investors come together and they agree to invest in a project, for instance, that they like, right? But most importantly, you also just have community grants or community funds, where people basically just come together or partake in a fund and say, you know what, we want to grow the open campus ecosystem here in London or something, or in Kent or whatever, right? They can come together and they can make a proposal to the community and then get a certain amount of funding to help build a space to build awareness. Many of the conferences, for instance, right? Many of the conferences that you see around that talk about crypto and Web3 and so on are funded by these DAOs, right? So the ApeCoin DAO is a community-funded program where people are talking about ApeCoin, and they go to a conference somewhere around the world and it gets paid by the DAO for people who then this becomes a full-time job, for instance, right? So this is, and by the way, I think the future of all, of the future of the largest corporations in the world, as we think of corporations or institutions, are going to be DAOs, as in they're going to be community-owned and not corporately owned. And we have some good examples of that. For instance, Ethereum, which is, worth $300-400 billion or so. Who owns Ethereum?
Nobody.
Nobody owns Ethereum. And millions of token holders, right? Who owns Bitcoin?
Nobody.
Yeah, plus $1 trillion. Exactly, right?
Some do say Putin.
Yes.
Behind the scenes, but
Just,
we have no proof.
Yeah, unlikely.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there'd be a lot more Bitcoin selling. I guess,
that's right.
Exactly, and we'd be seeing that. Anyway, my point simply is that we can already see the inklings of the largest corporations, or corporations is the wrong word, largest institutions in the world that are community owned in the form of these DAOs. And eventually, in due course, they're going to be bigger than the largest corporations, which are in the trillions of dollars today. But eventually, I think, will be eclipsed by these community-oriented institutions.
This is also a way, if you learn about how DAOs work, for you to own a part of these things too. So Yat just mentioned their open campus. We'll put the link down below. That's definitely a resource you should check out. Thank you so much for sharing this all with us. I'm hungry. Should we go get some chicken?
Yeah, let's go have some food. Thank you.